Hello, and welcome to another week of the Story Darks podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we continue our book club style deep dive into The Unwritten by Mike Carey and Peter Gross. And this week, it's a little more disjointed than what we're used to. It's Volume 9, which is the Unwritten crossover with the Fables, which you should have just read, and the Unwritten Tommy Taylor and the Ship That Sank Twice, which is not numerically part of the catalog, and was never out in single issue, right?
It was
straight to hardcover.
Yeah, an original graphic novel put out as a standalone, but it did, from a publishing standpoint, it came out. It was released right as the issues like 53 and 54 were coming out of the Unwritten, which are
Sure.
in Volume 9 here. So if you were reading all of this as it was being published in single issue, you would have gotten the OGN right as you were finishing what was this final arc of the Unwritten Volume 1, as it is
Right.
called.
And who was pulling 54 single issues of The Unwritten and then is going to opt out for the original graphic novel at the end. It's automatic sales.
Yeah,
that being
especially
said,
since
it's probably, I mean, it's also interconnected, but it's probably one of my favorite pieces in The Unwritten.
What, the OGN?
Yeah, the Ship That Sank Twice.
Oh, yeah.
I just thought it was just perfection. And I think, honestly, for unwritten vibes, when I don't feel like sitting down and rereading 12 volumes, I'll probably just go reread that. Because gives it gives you the plot and the mechanics of the world. I think it would call to memory all of the things you loved about the series.
Yeah.
Without having to go through all of it again. Granted, no Pullman or anything like that, but
I think it's one of those things, because it is, we'll get a little into the OGN a little bit later, but just to touch it up top here, it is two parts. It's two stories there. It's the actual narrative story of the first Tommy Taylor book, because the Tommy Taylor and the Ship That Sank Twice, that is the title of the first book that Wilson wrote. That is the beginning. It's the origins of the character of Tommy Taylor and all that. But it's also it's intercut with all this prequel, his journals and things like that. But it only works story-wise if you read it at what we'll call now at the end. You can't start this in the beginning, because you need that knowledge base from everything that Carey and Gross laid out in those first 8 volumes. You need to have all that history, have all that understanding. You need to already know how the world works and kind of know who some of those characters are. I think for that part of the OGN to really land. So I think you're right when you say
for it to land, which I think is what makes it the most rereadable. That being said, I think I could give this to my wife and she could read Ship That Sank Twice, be like, okay, well, the whole journal thing was a little weird, but I get it. And man, if you had that leg up when you read Volume 1, whew, it's more spoiler than it is, because it's not like they invented this mechanic once they were 20 issues in. They knew this the whole time.
Yeah.
Part of the fun of the reading was the discovery of it.
Yeah, it's the order in which. I agree with it. It is like it does. The question whenever comes up of how do you watch movies that are produced out of chronological order,
Right.
or how do you read books that are produced out of chronological order? Do you go in release order, or do you go in chronological order? And my answer is always release order, because even though stories are prequels, they're created. They're created.
Everyone who first read it would have already read the chronology.
They're created with the knowledge and the understanding that the previous stories, which are technically later in the series, in the timeline, came first. So you have to have that knowledge, because you're right. It isn't just about what is being revealed; it's how and when things are being revealed. So no,
right.
I don't think.
I remember being lambasted online a few years ago. I was like, okay, I missed it as a child. I didn't read it, so now I'm going to read Chronicles of Narnia, and I picked up an all-in-one edition. and they had them in canon order rather than release order. So you began with The Magician's Nephew.
Interesting.
And I didn't know that was like wrong, but boy, did I hear about it. And for the record, I still got bored with the series. I finished like The Horse and His Boy, and I was like, okay, this is like, it's too childish. Like I just didn't enjoy it, and I was like, why would I force myself to go 4 more books or whatever?
Wait, so was that you're talking about an all-in-one volume, not like a box set order? Like
no, it's a big paperback that has all-in-one, and it goes 0 to 7, and obviously, like I know enough of the beats, like in general, for the series being so popular.
Yeah.
Like I understood in The Magician's Nephew when they take this wood and they make a wardrobe out of it, that it's like, oh, okay, but that's exactly the situation here, right? It's okay, well, that came out last and it technically came before this.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. If you only read, so I started to warm up to Wilson Taylor by the end of volume 8. You read this again and you're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. You see all the schemes. You see all the machinations. You see everything. Yeah. He's pretty grimy here.
So in that sense, it's like, I mean, they did put you back chronologically because even knowing like the future remorse, and he seems to be aware, like, I'm going to regret this someday, but what are my choices? Yeah. And obviously his choice is strangely parallel to Tommy's parents. No accidents there. Like, I'm going to do something that he's really going to hate me for. I just hope they can understand and forgive me once he figures out what this is all about.
Yeah.
So just, but I just thought Ship That Sank Twice was a perfect book.
Yeah, I think it's a fun read. And what I was going to say before is that I don't think you're wrong if you gave it to someone who hadn't read any of the series and didn't really know what it was about. I do think they can pull something useful out of it because, again, you do get the straightforward narrative of Tommy Taylor. So you are getting that boy wizard savior story, origin story. So you have that part there, and if some of the flashback in Wilson's journal, if those parts are a little weird and you don't quite understand that, I think you could gloss over that a little bit or get enough out of that to understand that what he's trying to do is bridge the gap between the real world and the story world. I think you can get enough out of it for it to be a worthwhile read. But the end result, though, is, again, I think what we have are two standalone kind of two side stories that aren't really connected. They're quasi connected they're connected to the world of the Unwritten, but they aren't connected to the narrative of the Unwritten,
Right. And that's why I understand why the graphic novel didn't come in the numbering, and it's not a numbered volume in the trade series, because you could skip over it and be fine. My objection's not there. It's that they didn't also do that for the Fables. Yeah,
it is a weird choice. Especially
that definitely should have been its own continuity numbering.
And especially because, as when we get to next week, when the Unwritten Apocalypse starts, or Unwritten Volume 2 starts, that being the 12 issues to wrap the series up, that went into a new title, technically a new title and a new number 1. So why did we start over there to finish up the story when the series could have ended theoretically at 49, and instead of labeling the Unwritten Fables as 50 to 54, that could have been a 5-issue mini that's still set in the exact same time period. But I don't think it's essential because the end of Tom is in the same place at the end of 9 that he was at the end of volume 8. He's falling through stories out of time and space and story, or whatever you want to call it. He's lost in these universes of stories, not in his own time frame, not in his own world. And the events of the Unwritten Fables really don't play into, they definitely don't play into the Fables universe. I'll get to as to why in a little bit. And they don't really show up again in the Unwritten. So it really is I think it's a fun lark. Again, as someone who read Fables first, and is a book that I truly love and cherish, I think I get more out of Volume 9 because I'm a Fables reader than I did because I was an Unwritten reader. And I think that's, if I have any negative kind of a tally sheet, I think that's the big mark on the con side for me from the Unwritten standpoint. And that, given that I there's no way I could approach this story from like the flip viewpoint of having read the Unwritten but not Fables. I don't know how well it lands, but because I have that prior knowledge and prior fandom, the things I get out of it, the things that I enjoy out of it, are seeing this kind of alt universe, other Elseworlds version of Fables. You know, like a different spin on the Fables characters that I like, versus seeing Tom in another story world. So it's a fun side story for me. But again, I don't know how essential it is that it had to be, published as volumes 50 to 54 of the continuing story. I think the more I think about it, the more I think you're right. It probably should have been its own side story and its own miniseries. And then when they came back for what became the Unwritten Apocalypse, that should have picked up the numbering.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can talk about this later, but the analog that I was thinking about when I was writing my little Goodreads review, which, by the way, I gave Ship That Sank Twice 5 stars, Fables crossover, I gave 3 stars, 3 out of 5. Meaning, like, I liked it, it's fine, but I might even skip it if I reread the series.
I will say that if you're doing a reread, 9 is absolutely inessential. I don't think you need to read that at all. And I feel that feels like I'm damning it. But in a sense,
I get what you're saying.
I don't know, because from a narrative standpoint, it doesn't factor in. It's just a fun read. I think it's a fun read, but again, that's because I love Fables. So anyway, you were saying your
so the comparison I thought of, and I think this is pretty apt, was if you read the Black Hammer Justice League crossover.
Okay, yeah.
So which I was excited about, and again, I enjoyed it. And I enjoyed it as a Black Hammer reader. I don't really read the Justice League. I mean, I know all the characters, so I enjoyed it on a couple levels. But when that came out, it put them on the farm, which was Black Hammer issues 1 through 12. Yeah. At which point, they'd already been off the farm in Black Hammer continuity.
Yes.
So it was retreading a story that was not only like finished, but like closed. And it redid it without really doing anything to it. It was like kind of fun because they just took the Black Hammer universe and stories and dumped our Justice League characters into them.
Yes.
So it's the old guy who's the Golden Age superhero. Batman fills in for him. Anyway, it was like, oh, okay, we're taking characters I love and sticking them in a different story that I love. And that's kind of fun, but you didn't really have anything to say about anything in either world. Yes, other than look how similar these two characters are.
Yeah. Well, and that's a pretty like out there and esoteric comparison. Less people have probably read the Black Hammer universe than read the Unwritten, but I've read them both, so yeah, it makes total sense to me. But yeah, no, it that is really good because it's just a matter of
it's like a
fun exercise. Yeah, it's a fun exercise.
And I think it's like don't you love all these characters from both series?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what the book is saying to me. It's like, don't you want to spend more time, just a little more time with these unwritten characters? Don't you want to spend a little more time? And I will say the thing that I probably most enjoyed about this as an unwritten reader was we finally got a prolonged narrative with the children from the stories, from the from Tommy Taylor and Sue and Peter. The most we ever got was like a 2 or 3 page cut in the early trades.
Yeah,
and here we have entire issues where we're like, oh, I see, and I see how Tommy is different than Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Tommy is not jaded and cynical like old Tom.
Yeah.
And he's like eternally hopeful. He's like always willing to help everybody. He meets the Fables characters for like 30 seconds and it's like, okay, who do we have to fight? Like, you know, I'm gonna help your world out. And I'm like, this is compared to Tom, who for 4 trades was like being dragged like a tired old dog on a walk, you know, with the collar, just scraping on every piece of sidewalk and everything. And it's like, gosh, come on, man.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I guess the fact that you actually get to see what the dynamic is between the 3 characters are, you know, between Tommy, Peter, and Sue, actually seeing them in a narrative. And of course, we'll get more of that in the OGN, but you know, if you read them in order, 9 would have been the first time you get that. I think that's a really good point. You know what? I guess before we get into a little more of 9, let's do some housekeeping on both these books here, because there's
a lot of names.
A lot to get to. So, you know, starting in volume 9, the Unwritten Fables. If you see the top of the trade, you know, you got 4 creators listed there: Mike Carey, Bill Willingham, Peter Gross, and Mark Buckingham. You know, so Carey and Gross are obviously the credited co-creators of the Unwritten, and Fables is technically credited to Bill Willingham alone. He's the writer, and he wrote every issue of the series. Mark Buckingham is the main artist throughout Fables. He wasn't the first artist. The first artist that started on Fables was Len Medina, but Mark Buckingham, he penciled over something like 70% of the series, which when you realize it's gone over 150 issues, is a lot of issues. So you know, Carey and Willingham are the writers, Gross and Buckingham are the main artists. The other finishers that are credited through 9, Steve Lee Aloha, who worked on Fables, Russ Braun, who worked on Fables, and then you have Inaki Miranda and Dean Ormiston, 2 artists who worked a lot on and have worked a lot on some of the issues of Unwritten in the previous volumes. You know, beyond that, in volume 9, the colorist Chris Chuckery, letters Todd Klein, and all the covers still by Yuka Shimizu. So that part of the creative team is still the same. So as we go back and forth, kind of in between these 2 stories, between Gross's main style and Buckingham's main style, you know, it's a little seamless. That having read so much Fables, Mark Buckingham style is one that I absolutely love, and one that I can pick out right away when I see it. So it's fun going back and forth, and it's fun seeing that art style and that character style pop up in the Unwritten. Oh, you know, one thing to note here that I have a little side note that I don't think we mentioned back in the 0 issue was that right before the Unwritten started, right before the publication started, which would have been you know, in 2009, Peter Gross actually drew some backup stories in Fables. He drew some stories in issues, I guess they were published in like 77 through 80, 81, 82, something like that. And those were published in late 2008, early 2009. So, you know, part of that kind of Vertigo family, Vertigo connection, having worked with Mark Buckingham, having worked in this universe before, you know, those were just like, I think 5, 6 issue page backup stories in those issues. So he worked on that prior to getting with, or at least having the first issue of the Unwritten published at Vertigo. So there is some cross connection there, in that Peter Gross actually worked in the Fables universe first before working on his own stuff. With
sense.
Mike Carey.
I mean, I thought like surely they have to be friends.
Yeah. And again, they're all, it's all part of the Vertigo family. And again, these are like second cousin stories in terms of the metafiction aspect. And then finally, real quick, the OGN. If on that cover you see there are 4 credited creators again: Carey and Gross, along with Kurt Huggins and Zelda Devon. Huggins and Devon, if those names seem familiar, you go back to volume 2. They were the additional credited creators for issue 12, which was the first Mr. Bunn Polly Bruckner story, the Willowbank Tales. So in terms of that art style, that kind of character design, which if you were to hold that up to a lot of the Wilson Journal backstory, you'll see that it's the same kind of drawing style. So they brought those 2 creators back from the Willowbank Tales to help out with the OGN. The other other credited finishers, these are all names that have pretty much been used, most of them throughout all of the Unwritten run. It's Al Davison, Russ Braun, Sean McManus, Dean Ormiston, and Gary Erkson. Colors being Al Davison, Chris Chuckery, Ava Dela Cruz, and Gene McGee. So a lot of the same collaborators they've worked on throughout the entire run of the Unwritten, whether it was through a spot issue here and there, whether it was the half issues, that they went and did. They kind of called in all hands to help out and contribute to this OGN, which again I think is pretty cool. It shows that they have this great team of people they've worked with and people they want to continue working with. And yeah, I think that comes from it's kind of this overall Vertigo family that the Unwritten joined, that Fables already existed in. Yeah. So what was your thought, Mike, as you read through 9, having not read Fables? Did you read through and were wondering, like, were you lost in what was happening? Did it matter what was happening?
I was
specifically.
Yeah, I think the one thing that works really well about coming to this as an Unwritten reader, which I suspect is probably the same for Fables, is that if you get thrown off by not knowing the Fables characters here, there's no way you made it to volume 9 in the Unwritten anyway. I mean,
that's fair.
With Mike Carey, you're like jab, hook, like every time you're picking up one of his books. So you're kind of primed to just say, I trust you, lead me down the path, lead me through this story. And I think if anything, I felt like, and this is bad, so I didn't retain character names other than Pinocchio and Geppetto, people like that.
Yeah.
But the old woman who's kind of the central protagonist of Fables, or at least here it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
I could tell, like, oh, I'm sure she's like, curmudgeonly but endearing in their world, but is like, we don't have the endearing relationship with her as Unwritten readers. She's just kind of a jerk.
Yeah, no. Well, so that's a good read, because in Fables she is a jerk. Because okay. So that character is so that's actually a pretty good. We'll do a little transition. I'll try and keep this short on a Fables primer. That character is named at the time. Her name is Frau Totenkinder, and she is one of the witches or magical beings in the Fables world. Now, I believe Totenkinder in German basically means like child killer. She is the evil witch that lives in the Black Forest. So whether that's Hansel and Gretel, anytime there is a grim fairy tale where there's a witch in the forest that is cursing or killing or doing anything to children, she is basically the amalgamation of that. She is what in the Fables universe saying is that all those witches are actually the same witch, and that's her.
Okay.
So her relationship, her relationship with any other character in Fables, in the Fables universe, is dependent on, again,
but kind of intrinsically antagonistic towards everyone.
Yes,
but very Wilson Taylorish. Like, I'm looking out for the good of this Fable world.
Yes,
even if no one likes me for doing it.
So the general backstory of Fables is there was a magical world that they call the Homelands. That's where all these fairy tale storybook characters exist. Many, many years ago, they were driven out of their world in a battle against the adversary. That's the main antagonist, the main enemy, called the adversary. They are driven out of their world into what they call the mundane world. So if you read through, when you're reading through the Unwritten Fables and you see them refer to people as mundies, that is non-magical people. That's the regular people in the mundane world. So they had to flee their home. Yeah, they had to flee their home world into the mundane world, and they set up their settlement in New York City in a place called Fabletown. And it's an area, a block or so of New York City that's obviously magically enchanted. They live in this giant building that's magically enchanted. It's very Doctor Who TARDIS-ish, where it's bigger on the inside because, again, it's all enchanted. And that's all controlled by the witch is on the 13th floor. And so at the end of volume 8 of the Unwritten, when Tom falls into this group of people, all those people around him, those are some of the witches of the 13th floor. The important ones being Frau Totenkinder, the old woman, the little girl, which is Ozma of Oz, and then obviously you see Geppetto and some other people there. But the way that this works in Fables is that all the the characters call themselves Fables. They refer to themselves as Fables. So it's Fables and it's Mondays. So it's magical folk, non-magical folk. Fables understand that they are story characters in the mundane world. They understand that they are characters and they believe that there is some connection with their ability and their kind of immortality tied to their storybook nature. So for example, this is a minor spoiler for an early kind of Fables plot point, but early on, so Snow White is essentially the main character of Fables. She's kind of the main protagonist. And early on, she's assassinated, or there's an assassination attempt. She's shot in the head. And that puts her in a coma, bed rest, whatever. And there's a question of like, well, is she going to die? What's going to happen? And her sister, Rose Red, is like, well, of course she's not going to die because she's Snow White. Everyone in the mundane world knows her. And so because she's so popular as a storybook character, inherently she's going to live forever. But me, Rose Red, no one knows who the hell I am. So if I trip over a log, I'm probably done for. Now, I ask you, do you know who Rose Red is, the fairy tale character?
No, but I'm actually ashamed that... Okay, so I was also trying to figure out, as I was reading, I was like, is every single one of these a character from something? And then I was like, oh my gosh, I've never read Aesop's Fables. Yeah. And I was like, maybe that's where everything's coming from, and I'm just totally ignorant.
Well, so the answer to the first question is yes. Every character in Fables is a character from something else or a representative character of something else. So
okay, so it might be like archetypal. Yes. If they didn't have the rights to like Pinocchio or something, they would have had.
Well, almost all of these are probably the main character. Yeah, right. Yeah. But so what I was saying there, so there is obviously in the Grimm fairy tales, there's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and literally everyone knows that story. Whether you know the specifics, everyone knows Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The Brothers Grimm, there's another tale that's called Snow White and Rose Red about two sisters, that has no connection with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But in the world of Fables, they decided, nope, these are the same. So you have one story that everybody knows, that's the popular story, which is why Snow White is so popular, and kind of where she gets her character, her drive from. And then you have this lesser known story of Snow White and Rose Red. They're saying, okay, well, now we're going to say these are the same people. Another example of that is Jack. If you thought about nursery rhymes and I said the name Jack, what comes to your mind? Is it
Jack and Jill? Yeah.
Or is it Jack and the Beanstalk? Or is it Jack? Or is it Jack over the Candlestick? And which is it in the world of Fables? The answer is yes. That is the same character.
It's all Jack.
There was a character named Jack.
So there's like a Jack Chronicles of all of his weird stories, and
so
all folded into one character.
So Jack actually gets a spin-off, Jack of Fables. He leaves the main story, and one of the things he does is he goes to Hollywood and he basically finances 3 blockbuster movies based on that: Jack and Jill, Jack and the Beanstalk, and Jack doing the Candlestick, with the idea of being, if I make myself the most popular fable in the world, then I'm basically immortal, Right. So he puts his story out there. So that's how these worlds kind of work. And so it is not the same again. So it isn't the same the way of like again, how we see they work in how the relationship between the magical and non-magical, or the story and the non-story in Unwritten are, where there it's the reader's belief in the story, their knowledge of the characters and the story being told, that fuels that person into actually having those powers and abilities. The idea that Tom is Tommy. So if they read these Tommy Taylor stories and they read Tom's story, he is imbued with the powers that the story says he has. The same thing that we saw Richie do in volume in the last volume as well. When Richie writes the Unwritten, he writes his own book, and in that book he writes that he turns into a vampire, and then everyone reads that and they believe that Richie Savoy is now a vampire. It's a feedback loop. That's not quite how it works in the Fables universe, but there is still a relationship there, in that the mundane world and the magical world, the storybook world, there is a connection and there is a tie. Again, I think stemming from the fact that Fables know that they are their own people, they have their own stories, but they know that they're storybook characters, and they know that those stories about them aren't exactly the stories of how they actually happen. It's like right. It's like if you think about their life back in their homelands as their real life, and the stories that we got either through Grimm or Aesop or Disney or whatever, that those versions of those stories we got, those are like based on or inspired by true stories. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of where we are. And I like that. I'm glad to hear that that you weren't completely lost, or I guess that you didn't feel the need to.
I didn't feel the need to understand,
to know everything. Yeah,
right.
yeah. And I think you're right when you say, if you've gotten this far in the Unwritten, you should be used to that sort of thing, hopefully by now. The idea of, I may not know what's going on, but clearly I'm not supposed to know, because I've never read, because if you've never read Fables, you can't be expected to know,
right. and there are bad writers where you're like,
yeah,
I don't know what's going on, and I don't think the author does either. Yeah. Or like, the author just can't articulate his idea, and that's why I'm confused. And I have enough confidence in Mike Carey to know, like, that's definitely not the case.
Yeah.
He's giving me exactly what he wants me to have.
Yeah. And I think they gave you enough through kind of exposition from the Fables characters to understand what's going on. Because you did mention the one thing I skipped over here. You did mention the connection, or in your mind, to Black Hammer and Black Hammer Justice League. How if you picked up Black Hammer Justice League crossover, it threw you back into a version of Black Hammer that didn't exist anymore, because if you were reading Black Hammer at the same time, the Black Hammer story had moved past where the crossover happened. The exact same thing happens here, in that if you were reading Fables and the Unwritten at the same time, because there was crossover, the original run of Fables ran from, was it 2002 to 2015? So there is overlap here towards the back end of Fables when the Unwritten comes out. But, volume 9, issues 50 to 54 of the Unwritten, they come out in 2013, summer, fall 2013, at the same time as Fables issues like 130 to 134, and Fables went to 150 in its initial run, which puts you somewhere in like volume 20 of 22 of Fables. But the storyline concurrently actually takes place somewhere in volume 14 of Fables, which is between issues like 86 and 93. So late 80s, early 90s issue-wise, which chronologically were released back in 2009, 2010. So
back when Carey was working on it.
Yeah, or right after Carey did his bit of right. guest appearance on in those backup issues. So yeah,
but
so
it's probably safest for. I mean, I think that way you're not forcing Fable readers to come by this to continue their story.
That's exactly where I was going next.
Okay, yeah,
it makes total sense to me, because again, the events from a Fables perspective, the events of this crossover like have no effect, because in the end, by Tommy blowing the horn / golden trumpet, by mirroring that image, that mirroring that part of his / Tommy's story, it basically erases the world. It erases what just happened. So the events, because tons of characters die, Fables characters die in this little story here that don't die in that way in right. Fables. So this is a total one-off story for Fables as well. So it's a race and doesn't exist. So by putting it so far back during this battle with Mr. Dark, which is kind of the next big story of Fables, like the first the first 75 issues of Fables, which I know sounds ridiculous to say out loud, but the first 75 issues Fables is very much an anthology. It's a bunch of side stories. Sometimes it's a 6-issue arc, 2-issue arc, 3-issue arc. Here's a one standalone thing. It's very much an anthology, but there is this general kind of overarching narrative, most similar to like Sandman, where there's like one story you're kind of following, and it's really kind of the return of the adversary of coming from the homelands and coming and following them through. That's like the first 75 issues. And then the next 75 to 100, next 25 issues is like this next story of Mr. Dark, and that's where the Unwritten drops into. And then 100 to 150, it's really kind of character focused, and it really focuses on Snow and her family and Bigby, who is the big bad wolf. Another character that's amalgamation. That the character you read about Bigby here is the big bad wolf from any big bad wolf story. So anytime there's a wolf anywhere, that's him. So it focuses on that. So this falls in this like middle section story wise, narrative wise for Fables. But by the time you're reading it in 2013, you're already past it. And so they do it in a way where it doesn't offend anything that came before it. You know,
right.
It doesn't.
Although I have to say,
trot on anything. It doesn't retcon anything.
Right.
Because they retcon it themselves when Tommy blows the horn and erases all of it.
And if I've learned anything from this experience, is that Fable readers and really Vertigo readers at large, like there's no way they weren't going to be on board for another side story. Like, you know, it's like, you didn't force them to do it because like you didn't pause making Fables to do this for 6 months and then, you know, go back to Fables. And this was the only thing available to them. But like, if you were really invested in that universe, like who wouldn't do this? Like, you know, and which is again why I use that analogy of like Black Hammer Justice League. Like, you know, beyond the shadow of a doubt, there's no way that crossover is going to impact anything in the DC canon, right? Yeah. There's no way that has any weight on Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman and all those characters. So it's like, okay, so there's no damage to be done on that side, no really even impact to be had there. And then on the Black Hammer side, as soon as you pick it up and read it, and you're like, oh, this is back on the farm. There's no way this is impacting any of the continuity here because that's already resolved. We're already done there. So now we know this is an exercise for fun.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's like, if your reading isn't fun, like, why are you doing it? You know?
Yeah. And I have to imagine this was a lot of fun for the creators as well. Because again, knowing that a lot of these guys had already worked together on various different things at various different levels, you know, and all being under this Vertigo umbrella, and knowing how similar the idea is. Again, both of these stories play with the idea of the nature of storytelling, the power of storytelling. They're stories about stories, and so they are so related, even though they're wildly different in their approaches. They're so similar enough that, I'm sure when they thought about doing a crossover or having, you know, the stories merge, I have to imagine all of them got like really excited and had a lot of fun throwing story days about and started talking about things like, okay, well, if we did this, you know, how would we do it? You know, what characters would it be? When would it happen? You know, how would these worlds interact? And doing it in this way with Tommy falling into their story, which again makes total sense because it's Tom Taylor falling into another story. It's another world of stories,
right?
You know?
Well, and while the timing didn't matter for Fables, you couldn't have done this after volume 3 of the Unwritten.
No.
Like maybe after volume 4, like after he exits Leviathan and he's trying to come out of the glass of water and he comes out here instead. It's like, you could like cut it in there, but as an unwritten reader, that would have pissed me off at that point.
My God, same wavelength here. The only other place this could have been was after he goes into Moby Dick, and after he comes before, and you could have said, "Oh wait, this is."
It could have been one issue as like a test run.
Well, no, and so this goes now. Saying out loud, if this had been a total separate crossover, and it was not issues 50 to 54, it was the Unwritten Fables 1 through 5, meaning it could have been said at any time in either universe. You could have said, you could have framed this story in a way where this happened while Tommy was traveling through the various stories that had ocean and water in them, you know, because we know that's how he gets back. That's how he comes back out of the glass of water in the diner with Lizzie and Richie. So you could have just said, oh, wait, this is happening as he's lost in Leviathan, lost in Moby Dick. And, oh, it's happening back in the world of the time when the Fables were fighting Mr. Dark and all that. And you could have taken it out of time from both of those, but not done it chronologically. Said just as a total side story, much like the Black Hammer Justice League crossover, because that chronologically doesn't happen. You know, that's its own miniseries for Black Hammer as well. That wasn't set in the numbering of Black Hammer like this was set in the numbering of the Unwritten. So they could have pulled out both of the stories, and I think it could have worked that way. But given the framing they gave Tommy of having just fallen down the steps at the end of 8, you know, it makes sense here because, as we kind of mentioned, Volume 8 is this like soft ending to the story, you know. So I think they felt it was good time for them to then have a little lark of a story, a little sidestep, and tell this fun little tale on the side. Because again, you end Volume 9 in the same place. Tom, if you're reading this from the Unwritten point of view, Tom, our protagonist, ends Volume 9 effectively in the same place he ends Volume 8. You know.
Right, which means you can go insert little pocket stories here anywhere.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think the potent thing about this, that's the big distinction between this and like the Black Hammer Justice League crossover, is that these are the same publisher, meaning they're cross-promoting their properties, whereas you went Dark Horse TC for the other one, and it was like, is Dark Horse trying to sell more DC books? I think DC's fine. Yeah. You know, is DC trying to help Dark Horse? I really doubt it, knowing DC.
No, I think that crossover happens because it's Jeff Lemire being like, hey, can I do this? And both publishers being like, you know what? Yeah, you can, because you're Jeff Lemire. I mean, honestly, that doesn't happen any other way. He had a good idea and DC thought it was fun and they let him do it. Yeah, here being all on Vertigo, knowing it's all under one imprint, one family, and knowing how they're related, you can cross over. And I think it.
Well, and it's like the premise of the Unwritten is the most crossoverable premise. You know, of anything out there.
I wonder. Talking to my brother, I'm almost positive my brother only heard of the Unwritten because he saw that there was this quote unquote crossover. Because again, not really a crossover. It's the Unwritten dropped into the Fables universe. Not really a crossover, but
I think it's kind of how like the CW does crossovers. Not that we really want to go down that rabbit hole, but like,
well, no, they did full. Well, so
but it will be hosted on someone's show.
Well, no,
it will be like on the Flash's show. All the other characters come in.
Well, yes and no. They did both. So when, like, this is a weird tangent, but when Supergirl first started, Supergirl was on CBS. I think
the weird part is that we're both admitting that we watched it.
Well, no, those crossovers are actually pretty good. But
I know they are, but I don't have a lot of pride in watching them.
What I'm saying is, when Supergirl first started, it was on CBS, not the CW. So when it crossed over, Supergirl got to go to the CW shows, but not vice versa. But then when it was dropped by CBS and everything became on CW, like when they did Christ on Infinite Earth or whatnot, those, like, you had to watch Flash, Arrow, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow. You had to watch all of them because that was a full crossover. You had to watch all those. You had to watch all those stories. Sometimes it was just like, again, the first Supergirl Flash crossover, Kara went over into the Flash universe because they couldn't go the other way because of rights reasons.
Right.
So that situation is more like Tom falling into Fables.
That's true. Although that particular crossover had like a very Unwritten Fables vibe, because it was like, okay, so here's one character from one network coming onto the show of another character from another network.
Yeah. But
they're doing a musical because both of these actors were in Glee, and that's where they got their start. And it was like a very, very meta type crossover. And in the same way, it was like superfluous and unnecessary. But like, it's just super fun for everyone who's a fan of anything.
and they are trying to cross promote there. They do want to say, if you're watching this thing, you should also watch this other thing, because it is under the same production umbrella, even though they're being broadcast on different networks. It's all the same. That was the Greg Berlanti Arrowverse. It's all the same people in charge of all of that stuff. And so, there is a crossover. And I think even though at this point the Unwritten had gone, with the half issues, it's gone more than 50 issues. It had gone for 4+ years. They still wanted to have this crossover, whether it was to boost sales or visibility or whatnot. I don't know. I tend to think it was just because they thought it'd be fun to do as creators. But I mean, what I was saying before is I believe this is how my brother found the Unwritten, because he saw that there was, hey, what is this fable story that isn't really a fable story? But what is this other book that has fables in it that also has, Willingham and Buckingham as creators here listed there? So that's how he came to find the Unwritten, because he was a dedicated fables reader and saw this other fables thing that wasn't actually fables, because it wasn't a direct crossover with what was happening in the fable storyline. So he saw that.
I think a lot of that mileage, it like really varies on your comic shop and where they're placing Vertigo.
Well, yeah, it does.
If it's an obscure rack in the back and you have to say, like, where's the Vertigo section? Whereas, like, I was aware of the Unwritten basically as soon as I started going to comic shops, because the artwork was so gorgeous on the covers. I was like, I don't know what that book is. And I think by the time I was looking at it, it was like, the first one I really remember seeing on the rack as like a new release was the one with the Tinker cover. And it was like, I don't even know what that is, but I want
it was that. It was the old school 1940s comic cover.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was so cool.
Yeah.
But it was like, I can't just pick this up. I certainly, had I picked up that single issue, I would have been like, what in the world is this old man like lunged out of a bed, attacked this other guy, then like drew a chalk stairway and disappeared. It's like a little weird issue.
Wouldn't have made any sense. Hey, but every issue is potentially someone's first issue, but that'd be a weird one. So,
well, I think that's the thing with the Unwritten is it's not the easiest thing to jump into. You really have to go chronologically.
You got to start with one, and I always superhero comics, the stuff that's got 80 years of history, you can really jump in anywhere because it's been, but when you
usually
get a story,
whenever they change writers or even story arcs in a big two, it's like, they finished a 12-issue series. There's going to be one paragraph in the front of the next issue that explains everything you need to know.
Even stories that are billed as anthologies. Again, my favorite, which are literally my favorite comics of all time. Something like Sandman, Fables, Criminal, Astro City. A lot of those, and especially Sandman, at least it used to say, like on the back cover of the collections, they used to say, the third collection of the Sandman, blah, blah, but you can something, but you can read them in any order because the narrative is whatever it is. I get that you can do that, but like still in my mind, again, I want to read things the way they were released, because if you read something in issue 17, even though it doesn't connect to what happens in issue 18, 19, and 20, but you read 17 first. And even if they don't get back to it until issue 35.
I agree. Even if you're not technically learning anything about the character reading it that way, you're learning something about the author.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you're learning about the trajectory.
Yes.
The universe.
So even though I love anthologies, they are absolutely my favorite comic stories to read. Whenever I reread them, maybe I'll jump in and read a storyline here or there. But if I'm doing a full reread, it is chronological. It is absolutely, I'm starting at 1 or volume 1, and I'm reading those collections through because I want to get that story. I still want to get that story delivered to me the way the creators did, even though it's not a direct narrative story, like a neat and clean through line narrative story. The universe they're building issue to issue, arc to arc, comes out in a very specific way. I love to read it that way. And the Unwritten, again, I think we talked about last week. It has those anthology elements. It does some of that early on with the Polly Bruckner stuff, the Willowbank stuff, the Tinker thing. You have these other side stories that eventually all come together because they really are telling one focused narrative story, even if it doesn't seem all that focused to begin with, right? Because it seems a little wide ranging, a little contra spread gun action at first, but by the time you get to volume 7 and 8, everything narrows together and you see, okay, this has all been one story the whole time. And that's what their goal is. And nothing wrong with that. It's great. I love having that too. But you really do got to start at 1 here and you got to work your way through. If you had picked up that first Tinker issue, that would have been, what is that? That'd have been in the 30s somewhere, right?
I was going to say 27 or something, but
late 20s, early 30s. Yeah, that's a few years in. That'd be a hell of an awakening to try to read that and have any idea what's going on.
That being said, one podcast host that I know we both listen to is Jason Concepcion, and he one time was asked to give advice to new comic readers, and he said, just like pull out a cover from anywhere that looks interesting to you and enjoy the challenge of trying to figure out like what must be going on in whatever world you're reading. And I was like, that stresses me out. And I think with like, I understand when he was a kid, and if I had read comics as a kid, that's what you would do. In this day and age, you just Google it.
Well, yeah, but I would say that is excellent advice if you wanted to pick up a superhero comic from Marvel or DC. I think that's great advice. That doesn't make sense to me if you're like, I'm going to pick up, East of West 15, or I'm going to pick up Saga 26. Like that kind of thing. It makes less sense to me. But yeah, if you wanted to go and grab, Spider-Man, 15 legacy number, whatever it was at the time, 872 or whatever, and just try and do that, or grabbing, Amazing Spider-Man, 638 from years, that I think is a great challenge. And you want to have some fun with that. That makes more sense for a title and a character and a publisher like that.
Right. Because when it comes to the, you can be, the premise so well when it comes,
yes.
If you pick up Batman, 51 from Tom King's run, and he's like doing the trial for Mr. Freeze, and you have Bruce Wayne turning everyone against Batman.
Yeah.
But I think you maybe even read that it's like right after he's left at the altar and he's like emotionally devastated and all this other stuff. You're like, okay, like,
doesn't actually
I know
matter.
who Batman is. I know how the world works. So I can enjoy this little like 2-act play of 51, 52.
Yeah.
Whereas
the 12 Angry Men. Yeah.
If you'd never heard of Gotham and you've never heard of Batman, and you don't know that he's actually Batman and that he puts on a suit and then he does it because of his parents and that he's got this emotional trauma that was driving him to do this stuff, and then another trauma dislodges that from him, it's probably harder to pick it up. And I think that's the case here. It's like, you're not going to understand the Tommy distinction. You wouldn't even know who Wilson is on most single issues. So it's complicated. But that being said, I think a lover of fiction could do it. And like, I would give issue 17 of the Unwritten to a stranger. That's the Lizzie. The lives of Lizzie Hexam.
I think that works because there you're telling someone like that's all about the mechanics of the story. To say like this is what you can do, and it's actually not important if you know who anything is. You can get lost. He said you can get lost in the mechanics of that issue, which I think are very, very cool. But I could also see someone reading that and being like, "Wow, that was really cool. I didn't know comics could do that," and then also being like, "Yeah, I don't care to read anymore." Like to have no connection to the story, the character, anything like that, and not have that not pique their interest in this story, but potentially pique their interest in, oh, you can do some really cool stuff. Yeah, you can do some really cool stuff. Some real cool outside the box stuff. So I could see that. I could see that working in that way because I agree. It's a fun issue, but it doesn't. Nothing about that issue necessarily would grab you about the story of the Unwritten.
Right.
At least I don't think so. I don't think so.
I think you'd be interested in, maybe. You would certainly think the story's about Lizzie when it's, it's really not. You go issues and issues without Lizzie.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we should wrap on this Fables thing. Yeah. My big takeaway is I had 3 things written down. One, it's fun to see the trio at work in an extended story, which we got, and then we're about to jump even deeper into
Yeah,
with
to
the
really
original
sit
graphic novel.
Yeah.
I called it a fun mid-level story, especially mid-level if you're an Unwritten only fan.
Yeah. And I would say I think that qualifies as mid-level Fable story, because it has no effect on the Fables universe. It's just
Right.
it's a fun lark. So yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, to me, it's like the last, I don't know how many things like the MCU has put out. I'm like, yeah, it's mid-level MCU. The problem is it's getting a little swollen around the midsection now in the MCU, and there's no other mid-level Unwritten.
This is closer from a Fables perspective. This is as close to a what if story as you're going to get, as if a true what if story, and that this is because it has no effect. It has no, everything that happens in here gets erased after the fact. So this is like Fables what if.
And then my final thing is that just one, I feel like there are a few really charming vignettes in here. And I think those were the things that I enjoyed more so than like the big story. The big story is fine. It was very predictable, beat for beat. Just what's going to happen. But when you get these little character moments, I especially enjoy between Pinocchio and Tommy. And in the bottom left corner of this page, where Tommy says, "Being human is meh." Pinocchio says, "Mostly." Tommy says, "But you were a puppet." And Pinocchio says, "What? You think flesh and blood kids don't come with strings attached? Clearly you don't know many parents." Yeah. I loved that. And I will say it's also true that Tommy didn't know many parents. Tommy didn't know his parents. Tom only knew one parent and not really. Mm-hmm. So it's like, that whole Tommy thing. I was also a little confused about when Tom was transformed to Tommy, if that was a sub in, sub out, or if it was actually him being transformed. Like, was there some shared consciousness between Tom and Tommy? I initially thought it was, but then by the end I was like, no, I think they just swapped. They were like, we're just going to take your avatar from another universe, because that was the Fable mechanic they were explaining. They were like, look, there's a Tom in every universe. There's a Richie in every universe. This universe is Richie. It's just straight up a vampire.
He's one of the vampires. Yeah. And so I think what they were doing there, and that was what you saw Totenkinder do, like that second spell, was like, listen, we wanted, we were trying to, the story said it was, we're trying to conjure this great wizard, and they basically were like, we were like one step off. We got Tom Taylor, who's not a great wizard, but we were close. And so she finishes the spell, quote unquote, and pulls in the great wizard of Tommy, but has to get all of it. And that's why you get Tommy, Peter, and Sue. So it was a replacement. We have to get
really rude to say all that right in front of him.
That's
all I have to say.
Well, but again, this is Frau Totenkinder is among the worst people that have ever existed in the Fables universe. But again, one important point I should point out is that by coming from the homelands, because again, the adversary destroyed everything, good, bad, or indifferent. Anyone coming into the Mundy world and joining Fabletown had to sign the Fabletown Pact, which is basically full amnesty for anything you've done previously. So nothing you did before could be held against you. And moving forward, you basically agree to always work towards and protect Fables. So a lot of people have grudges against Frau Totenkinder because she did bad things. There's also a secondary part of Fabletown, which is called the Farm, which is a farm upstate in New York, which is really funny to talk about because that's where all the Fables who can't pass for human live. So that's where all the animals are, things like that, blah, 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 blah. That's where all the talking animals, any talking otherwise inanimate objects, are up that way.
Yeah, but that's the classic, when your dog dies, it's like, oh no, we sent him on a farm upstate.
Yeah. But they're up at the farm. But I mentioned it because while everyone had to sign again, got amnesty at Fabletown or whatnot. Bigby, the big bad wolf, he's not allowed up at the farm, even though he has signed the pact and he is the sheriff of Fabletown. He's protecting everybody. He's not allowed up at the farm because of how many people he killed and terrorized all those animals up there that he hunted and killed back in the homelands. So everyone is forgiven. So even though Frau Totenkinder was a bad guy, as it were, back in the world, in their world, she is on the side, quote unquote, of the Fables, because they are working together. But yes, she is a fairly terrible person. So her being completely unfeeling and outright rude and dismissive of Tommy, really all of them, like Ozma is the same way. Most of the magical people are pretty derisive towards anyone not them. So the fact that they just like degrade Tom as he's standing right in front of them and don't really care about it, that's very much in character for them.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's all good to know. That was all fun. So anyway, yeah, like I would not tell someone reading this, obviously, since we're doing a book club podcast on it, I wouldn't tell someone to skip this. Like, I think you should read it once.
Yes. Definitely.
And I think the art alone is worth like tuning in for.
Yeah.
And again, it's your first extended adventure with the trio. Mm-hmm. I am only hesitant to like. I wrote that down after I finished Volume 9, and then I read a much more extended and better treatment of the trio.
Yeah,
and it was like, oh, okay, so we actually don't need it Volume 9 for that as much as I thought we did.
No. But I think you're right. When you read through the first time, you read it, you see what the creators have in mind, you see what they like to do. On a reread, it is less important, and I think the more times you reread it, I think the less essential it becomes. That does seem like it's I'm kind of downgrading it, and I guess I am in some way, but it is not essential to the overall story, and I think you have to be honest about that. That it doesn't play a factor. It feels like the brainchild of comic creators who are friends and collaborators who got together when like, hey, wouldn't this be fun if we did this? And everyone was like, yeah, let's do it. And that's what birthed out of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, you get a great story.
I got no objection there.
You get a great story, you get a fun story, but you get a non-essential story. So
yeah, and you know, I will just say the last thought I had there was when you were describing this farm upstate, I was like, so they're putting all their characters on a farm. That could be a Black Hammer crossover. Yeah. Like, let's do it.
Different kind of farm. It
doesn't matter. Like, I'm like, in Fables, if they take everything as such broad strokes that all Jacks are Jack, surely all farms are farms, and you could stick your Black Hammer cast on there to tell a little story, and all the animals are talking, and they're like, you know, what is this farm, and why can't we escape? So anyway, I think that's fun. Although I think Black Hammer is basically wrapped or in its final stage.
Yeah, the last days of Black Hammer have been being published on it had been published on as part of Lemire's Substack. But I do think the trade for that comes out very soon as we're recording this. But yeah, it's in the throes. It is finishing up. Part of that is also, you know, he signed his overall deal with Image, and
right.
His Black Hammer stuff stays at Dark Horse, but he had to be in the process of wrapping that up. So
that's another anthology I'd love to do at some point. Big surprise! I would like to do a Jeff Lemire piece.
But you
also
want to cover all Lemire at some point. So.
Right. As of the time of this recording, we're recording this the week that the full poster came out for the Essex County show, and that show drops exactly 1 month from the recording date of this. And I'm like, oh shoot, there's no way we could crank out an Essex County podcast before the show comes out. But you know, that's one that, you know, I'd love to cover at some point. You know, well, I know also, we've said Descender Ascender a million times. Yeah. So anyway,
well, you know, also neither one of us live in Canada, so it'll be tough. It's going to be tough for us to watch Essex County. So
yeah, there are VPNs out there, but anyway,
I didn't say impossible.
Right,
I said tougher.
Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to pretend that we are good. You know, if it came to it, I would do a road trip and stay in Toronto for a weekend and stream. I love Toronto, great city, reasonable drive from here, and I would just stream the entire thing in one binge weekend in another city. That sounds fun to me. That might be a little bit of a waste of a trip for going to Vancouver or something like that, but Toronto, yeah, no problem.
Sure.
If we're really desperate, we could drive straight north and hit Windsor right across
just go to
Detroit.
Windsor. Yeah.
Sit in a hotel room with some Tim Hortons donuts and go on a bender with Essex County.
And the casino's right there across the street, across the way from Detroit. You could stay there.
That's true. You win some loonies.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Ship That Sank Twice.
Yeah.
I'd like, it's 5 stars for me. This is like absolute unwritten perfection.
Yeah.
My only complaint is that how dare Mike Carey give us this without actually writing the novel for Tommy Taylor? Like, he doesn't owe us 14, but he could easily, with everything he's laid out and his obvious skill as a writer, it'd be so much fun to get, I don't know, 3 Tommy Taylor books to like go through his school years. And, I do. Seems like a pipeline for money.
I really do wonder, given that Mike obviously also, he writes not just comics, he writes screenplays, he writes prose books, he writes novels.
He's M.R. Carey if you're looking for him.
Yes,
in novel.
yeah, M.R. Carey. I really do wonder how much of each of the 14 Tommy Taylor books does he have? Like, does he have more than just a title? Does he have like a full synopsis? Does he have like an executive summary for each one? Like, how much does I really truly wonder how much he has in each one of those, because part of me thinks that if you are that kind of a creative, like, you can't just stop at writing the fun titles, right? Like, you can't.
I think he has a single beat for each one, because he knew like
a log line going to
be called. Well, I think he knew like if this is going to be called Tommy Taylor and the Golden Trumpet, that he had to understand what the Golden Trumpet is in case he wants to use that in the Unwritten. And
okay.
So I think he needed at least that much.
Okay, so that makes sense, because I think one of the books is Tommy Taylor and the Magic Doorknob. I think that's one of the right. That's either book 2 or 3. Okay, so in terms of how it feeds into his unwritten story, in terms of what those artifacts are, you think he had at least that point, but you don't think he had to have
at least. Well, yeah. I'm telling you, that's the minimum he had.
Minimum. So
that's like
just the log line tagline.
Yeah. Those are chess moves, because he has to leave himself enough pieces, because he can't. He dropped those titles of the Tommy Taylor books early in the Unwritten. And you can't say in volume 7 of the Unwritten, oh shoot, I need Tom to have this mechanic. Well, there's this lost book that was actually the 16th non-canonical book, but a lot of people read it, so it's got power. So now he has this, magic, whatever.
Yeah.
He had to know before putting pen to paper all of the toys he would want to have as options. Like, he's building.
Yeah. Okay.
That would be like if I don't know, Bill Finger or someone had to decide everything on Batman's tool belt years before he had a belt.
And it's like, this is what he has. Right. This is only what he has.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. This is all he'll ever be able to acquire. And, everyone who writes this in the future will just have to bear in mind, like, there are this many slots on the belt, and they're already committed to these things. Use them or don't use them, but you can't use anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, real quick, shouts, Bill Finger. Let's, get out of here, Bob Kane. Shouts to Bill Finger.
I didn't mean to leave Bob Kane out.
Forget Bob Kane. He shut out Bill Finger for years on purpose. Stole credit from him. Bill Finger all the way. But anyway, no.
No. Wait. Okay, stealing credit. Okay, wait. So this is my favorite thing from The Ship That Sank Twice, and this is like a thesis statement for the series. And I read this line out loud to my wife as I was reading. And this is from Wilson's diary. He says, "But that's the whole point, of course, to invade and then redecorate, to make my character such a powerful archetype that he works backwards and erases his own precursors." And I'm like, first of all, I had
that quote written down too, by the way. I had that written down as well.
Oh, it's my favorite thing. And it's so true, because I hate when you start talking about like a book or a movie or a comic or anything, and you get some person who's like an originalist, and they're like,
Yeah.
well, that's actually, this thing came first. I'm like, yeah, but this was better. I'm like, who cares? Like, it's cool sometimes to point out like, oh, this is connected to this and this came before this. But at the end of the day, what's the better story? What's the more compelling character? Like, that's who wins. So it's who invades and redecorates. And that is certainly the story of reading early comics, was people stealing things back and forth. Not even just early comics. Like, isn't I forget which direction it goes, but like Deadpool, Deathstroke.
Oh yeah,
Are,
Wade
are
Wilson,
like
Slade
publishers,
Wilson. Yeah, yeah,
publishers stealing and riffing on each other,
yeah.
and not in that case, not malicious. Just like, oh, that's awesome. I love that guy. Let's do our own.
Yeah.
Give me a little tribute, and then it's like, well, which one do the fans like more?
Yeah,
that's the bigger character.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter which one came first.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think it also giving Wilson that line, it addresses the obvious elephant in the room that Harry Potter exists within the unwritten universe,
right? But we also have the fake Tommy Taylor book to see, like, this is how you do it poorly.
Yeah.
And then you have Wilson here slaving over this, criticizing his own writing, because there's a couple false starts at the beginning when he's trying to tell the story.
Which is, again, he calls them out by name. There's a Superman origin, there is the Narnia origin, there is the Lord of the Rings origin, and they give him in his journal talking about how how Tolkien is basically the blueprint for all fantasy. After that, there is the Dark Lord, the Quest, the Enchanted Object, whatever it is, the Chosen One, things like that. That everything is riffing off of that. That doesn't make everything Lord of the Rings, but it makes Lord of the Rings the basis for all this stuff.
No, but there are the people
because of how popular that became the template. Even though, that things like that had existed, and it's all about it. I think even early on, he's talking about like. Wilson's talking about like he addresses plagiarism specifically, right? Like, right. It's like, that's kind of what we're doing. Not really. The whole point is to tap into something that's already popular and is put new dressing over. Like, that is the point. That's what the story is about. It's why he talks about, the boy wizard, the orphan boy wizard. That story's really that archetype's really popular right now, which I think is a funny, again, meta commentary, because when you're reading this in 2013, you would say, yes, that's a popular archetype. But if you think about if this is in real time, 20 years somewhat earlier, it sure as hell wasn't a popular story type archetype back when he was writing, when Wilson would have been writing that story in real time.
Right.
But it still plays on the idea of this is why they chose to go why they, being Carey and Gross, chose to go down this archetype, why they chose to use this story, because they're making a point on the ubiquity of that character, the understanding and the acceptance of that archetype for being the center of your story.
Right. And this is so. First of all, like, so many analogs here, and I do want to talk about the actual story, not just about the story, but yes, like in that market at that time. So there are the people now who, for reasons I do understand, are just totally done with Harry Potter. Don't want to hear about it anymore.
Absolutely, I understand that. Yes.
And they're trying to say like, and I'm like, well, have fun, enjoy your Percy Jackson, which I actually like Percy Jackson. I just don't like it nearly as much as Harry Potter. But now people are desperate to say like, oh well, she actually stole this idea of a boy wizard from Neil Gaiman's Book of Magics, which came before that. Yeah. And I'm like, it came before it, but where's Book of Magic World? Also, where are the video games? Where are the Legos? Like, I'm not saying that as like someone obsessed with like market capitalism or something like that. Like, whoever makes the most money wins, but whoever grasps the most minds and captivates the minds and hearts of the readers is what becomes the dominant story, regardless of chronology.
You're the default winner at that point. whether through actions of your own or whatnot, if you're the one that penetrates the culture for whatever reason,
Right.
if you're the one that penetrates through, that means you've won. That's how it goes. It's not about being first. It's not about being first or being the best, or it's about having. It is who sold the most copies, who has the greatest penetration into the pop culture, and
right.
That
I mean,
means you won.
I don't think Kleenex invented facial tissue.
Yeah,
but I've never once in my life asked for a facial tissue. I asked for Kleenex because they win.
You ask for a Band-Aid.
Right.
Go get a Xerox machine.
Right.
These.
Yeah. So, and then the second thing I wanted to say is that, and this was years ago, but a friend of mine who's older than me, his son was like 7 at the time, and they had just watched all of the Harry Potter movies together, and they knew that I was like a big Potter fan, and he was like, he wanted to act like he was kind of above it. Like he's like, yeah, she did a pretty good job, but it'll never be, it has nothing on Tolkien. And I'm like, I think anyone who makes that comparison doesn't understand either book or genre or author.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Like that's just crazy. I'm like, what? Just because they both have magic? First of all, as we discussed last episode, Harry Potter and the Unwritten fall into the urban fantasy.
Sure. Yeah.
They exist within our real world. Harry could go to New York if he wanted to. Gandalf is not going to New York. Not an option.
Yeah.
He's on a completely different map on a different Earth, in a different time. So I'm like, that's just crazy. All the mechanics and everything are just different.
And I don't think that's ever was supposed to be the intent of.
No, I mean, I think there are things where she clearly like was inspired by Tolkien, as every fantasy writer since Tolkien has been.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned bringing up Tolkien, and I think the closer comparison would actually be the works of George R. R. Martin. The Martin very famously says, "Okay, Aragorn's king, but like, what's his tax plan? Like, how does he actually be a ruler?" All of Tolkien's story is about finding the ruler. This is him ascending to the throne, and Martin is like, well, like, what happens the next day? Like, how is he actually a ruler? And so even there, he's not trying to do Lord of the Rings, because that's not the story he's trying to tell his own version of that. What happens after
Lord of the Rings in his mind. I mean,
I
think he also asked about like the sewage system in it's like, oh, cool. All the parts that I didn't care about is what you're going to piece together into
but they matter to him, and so he wants to tell that story, which again, so even though his story is probably most comparable to something like Lord of the Rings, his intent from the jump is something different. So if you were to pick up A Song of Ice and Fire and be like, well, yeah, it's good, but it's not Lord of the Rings, well, he was literally not trying to write Lord of the Rings. So that means you have then missed the point.
Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
he's like, I enjoyed it deeply, but I got some problems here.
Exactly.
So I needed to make my own contribution to the field.
It's him saying, I love Lord of the Rings. It inspired me. That stuff is in the DNA of A Song of Ice and Fire, but I was literally not trying to write that. So for anyone to compare that, I think you're right, is to say, you've misunderstood.
He invaded and redecorated.
Yeah. You've misunderstood the thing that you read and the thing you're trying to compare it to. Like you swung and missed on both accounts.
Right.
You don't understand either of these things. And I think you're absolutely right about that. It's this
but it's gatekeeping. I mean, it's just it's what fandoms do now, which is just defensive, like in order for my thing to be great, I can't admit that anything else is good or that anyone can enjoy anything else. And it's like, what is wrong with the human brain? Anyway. So I'm glad we both wrote that down, because to me that's the best premise of the Unwritten, like the mechanics of like, okay, so now I understand that early on I was begging for the mechanics. I went and re-listened to like 1 and 2, and I was like, just tell me how this works. And now I'm like,
you were grasping at straws, like, give me something to hold on to. Give me something to grab onto.
And I was like, "What? Like, can they just switch in and out of fiction? Does fiction import into reality, or do they go into the fiction and they bring things out?" And if I were giving this series to someone, which I will, I'm going to talk to them about this quote. about the power of fiction and the power of creating things and, moving into inhabited stories and redecorating, because that is the more powerful premise for the Unwritten, much more so than like, oh, he invented some fun mechanics of how you kind of hop around and, you go from a water event to a water event. That's fun. Yeah. And maybe it would help you a little bit. Or like that great discussion in the War of the Words when Pullman makes the guy exposit the universe, and he's like, the power of belief and proximity. Yeah. Like those things. Yeah, that would have been kind of helpful in volumes 1 and 2.
But they are kind of pedantic in terms of like.
But it's not a selling point.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, that's not. I wouldn't buy the book because of that. I buy the book because of this.
Sure. Yeah, no, and what he's describing there, you think about, I thought you think about like Joseph Campbell and the Here Are a Thousand Faces and all that, which right. Like they're only a handful of these stories anyway, right? So just what is your window dressing on it? What's your spin on it? And it's not about being, it's not about trying to find. Not always about trying to find what's a completely new story. We always talk about that. What's a new story? What's an original story? And I think, what gets lost in the sauce is that these stories it's not about what the story is. It's about what you do with the story.
Right.
It's about your spin on the world, your spin on the characters, all this stuff. The story is the story. Yeah, you can reductively break down everything into, the just these basic archetypes. And if you do that, then nothing's original. But if you get lost in doing that, you probably are a boring person to hang out with, and you have no fun in anything. You're probably a terrible person to talk to. If that's your worry.
Yeah, I mean, if that's your
mentality, how you see story, and that's how you see story.
You shouldn't go to the movies with a person like that. Yeah. They shouldn't see movies. They shouldn't be allowed to see movies or new shows or read books or anything like that, because they don't know how to enjoy things.
Yeah.
Their only intent in analyzing them is to pull it apart and explain why you shouldn't enjoy it. Yeah. And why you should like something else better. And it's like, you're a great salesman for a public domain property that's been around.
Yeah.
And you think that once something has been done, no one ever needs it. I remember I had this discussion with a guy who was he got his master's of arts in literature from Wake Forest, a decent program, decent school. And I remember him commenting on my Goodreads review when I read The Hunger Games when it first came out. And I was like, really fun dystopian, great character story. I actually really enjoyed this book. And he was like, the dystopian thing's so worn out. Just go read 1984. And I was like, I'm sorry. Did the literature guy just say, as of 1948, dystopian literature is in its final form and we never need to do any other again? And to his credit, he then said, okay, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And then he read the book and he liked it. So I was like, I'm glad I gave an ounce of pushback. And there are still reasonable people out there.
You said gatekeeping, which is totally what it is. It's that faux intellectualism of like, well, this isn't any good because I know the thing that came first that it's based off of. You mentioned the Hunger Games. People who read the Hunger Games and want to dismiss that were like, well, it's just battle royale, which is kind of doubly, because not only is that's older, but like, it's Japanese, it's not even wasn't really written in English. So like I've read battle royale, and you don't need to read Hunger Games because that's just not so.
Well, and what it is
they both can exist. You can read it. You can read that and read the other thing and be like, you know what? These things are good for different reasons. Forget the fact that it's also, that your premise is the same,
right,
or similar.
The first time that I met my wife's cousin, she was in middle school. My wife and I were dating, and this was years and years ago. And she was like telling me all about like Pan Am and the map of like the Hunger Games world and all this other stuff. And she was in middle school, and I was like, yeah, I could give her 1984. She's not going to read that.
Yeah.
She's like, she wouldn't enjoy it, but she gets to learn about totalitarianism and all of these other dystopian concepts through something that she enjoys reading. And I think that's worth having in the conversation.
I agree. That's
and
great.
The gatekeeping, what you just described, just to add something, so we're an educational podcast, there's an informal logical fallacy that was coined by C.S. Lewis called bulverism. I don't know if you ever heard him talk about this. It's a form of ad hominem. And his definition, it was in an essay he wrote in the Socratic Digest. And which, why don't we have that publication anywhere? I don't understand. What happened to their sales?
Can't imagine what happened there. Yeah.
But he had this thing called bulverism, which was where you explain why someone is wrong rather than demonstrating that they are wrong. And his example was suppose, you were having dinner with your spouse and you say to her, I think 2 + 2 = 4. And she says, well, you only think that because you're a man. And it's like, I don't have to prove that you're wrong. I have to show why you can't be believed.
Yeah.
And she didn't say anything about whether 2 + 2 = 4 or his proof of that. It was that, well, you only think that because you're a man. And he said, first of all, that type of logic would cut both ways. Like, okay, well, you only don't think it does because you're a woman.
Yeah.
And so we got nowhere, with that argument. And you didn't address the thing that was actually on the table. You're addressing the optics of the argument rather than the substance. So that's
that describes the discourse.
Logical fallacy.
That describes the discourse of literally everything we have in the world right now.
I know,
like that is the fundamental problem for everything we have.
Which was
the absolute basis of.
He coined that in 1944.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I do, like, as I scroll through Twitter, I'm like bulverism. Yeah. As I'm reading, this week reviews that have come out for Quantumania.
Sure.
And I haven't seen it. I know you have. Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, this is bulverism. Like every time I read like some pretentious article that's like, superhero fatigue. It's like, oh, we're tired of these superhero movies. I'm the editor for this newspaper. I don't like them, but they keep making me go. You're explaining why a superhero movie can't be good rather than interacting with the thing you just saw.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the type of
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. And that's kind of thing that I think we have Wilson in the story trying to, he's the kind of thing he's working again. He's trying to weaponize some of this stuff, and we see those machinations throughout, which is why I think it, when we talked about, could you have read this, could this OGN been read at any point? Could you read the beginning of the story and still get what's going on? I think you could, but I think you lose some of the specifics because at this point in the story, you know what Wilson has done. You've been told, like,
and
about
how he feels about it.
Yeah. So now we're getting kind of that first person view. Since we're reading his diary, we're reading his journal entries. So I think it's more effective, coming at this time, at this point in the story.
Yeah, and I will say, there's a lot of things to say. I think throughout volumes 1 through where did he die? 3.
And he died in 3 or 4. Yeah, one. The second,
okay, so through 1 through 4, I would think Wilson is some kind of evil genius, right? He's maniacal, or at least a mad scientist, if not evil. He's a mad scientist, like, never the classic Jurassic Park question. Never asked could or should we. Just ask, could we?
Yeah.
And he's just pushing the boundaries of all these other things. And when you get into 5 and you realize, oh, he was just kind of the wet work guy for the Cabal and went rogue and is still figuring out how this stuff works. Like, he doesn't have a manual on it. He's experimenting to learn.
Yeah.
And hopes of countering the Cabal.
Yeah.
And here there is like a bit of surprise that it works.
Yeah.
Like he's very pleased, but he's like surprised. Like that's not the Wilson Taylor I expected after reading volumes 1 through 4. 1 through 4 would have been like, I know exactly what I'm doing. In fact, I thought And now that we're here, um, early on, I think you're meant to question, was Tom actually born, or was he written
Yes.
into a story and somehow entered our world? And then I was like, okay, well, that doesn't really explain, that would make him the written. What's the unwritten? And so then I was speculating later on in the series. I was like, okay, well, maybe maybe Wilson and many of these other characters were all written into existence, but they were basically fables or fiction come to life, who then made a flesh and blood child and Thomas the First, unwritten, made by written characters. And okay. I was like, that would be a fun way to explain the title. That also wasn't true.
Yeah.
But I had all of these fan theories, and now the unwritten, they've given us several uses of that word, and different context, different meaning each time. But I think the powerful thing here is that Wilson is more in love with his vision for Tom than he is with Tom. Yes. And that being said, he still seems to be slowly won over to Tom as the baby, but only in as much as he becomes like Tommy that he's written.
Yes.
So I see when he starts celebrating that, like, I don't know, 7-month-old Tom is starting to spew Latin phrases, whatever age he was.
Yeah.
He wasn't happy because it was like, I'm going to try to make my daughter, who turns 6 months tomorrow, at 7 months, I'll try to get her to spew some Latin phrases. But I would celebrate. But I would celebrate. Oh, my daughter is speaking Latin. She's going to be really smart. I've done it. Whereas he's not excited about that. He's like, Thomas Tommy.
Yeah,
it
it's
works.
Working.
Like,
it's working.
Right.
It's working.
That's he only cares about Tom in as much as he is Tommy, and as much as he's succeeding in his plan. It makes him just not a good father. It makes him a great author and a terrible father.
Well, and I think when we see him down in volume 8, there's more of an understanding about that now. There's a little more self-reflection there that he understands. But again, I think he would still say, yes, I know I'm a terrible father, but I did this because I had to. There's that self-delusion again, that I did this, even though he was figuring out as he go. His motivation for doing it was, we have to stop the cabal because they're evil. We got to stop them. I'm saving the world, as it were, by doing this, by sacrificing, by deliberately having a child and deliberately sacrificing any connection I might have with this child, because this is for the quote unquote greater good. I think he understands that makes him a terrible person. But he would say that he does it because, again, he's the one strong enough to take on that burden, to do that. But yeah, I think you see it here. Him, I think you then tie this back. What you read here, if you tie it back to 2 moments, one with Miriam and the birth of the Tinker, and Milton and all that, and it's seeing like, oh wait, that's what happens if you do it by accident. That happened, and we weren't even trying for it, and yet the stories we were telling and the child we made here, that this worked out and it happened by chance. So you see them. So now that we have that knowledge that he did that already, we see him try and plot it out with Tommy, again, not knowing if it's going to work, but thinking it's going to work, right? Because, well, we saw the trial run here. This is what happened when we weren't even trying. What happens if we meticulously plan this step by step? And you're right, he is excited when things happen, and when Tom does Tommy things, and which brings it to point 2 of the banishing of Polly Bruckner. Now Tommy is what he's like 7 or 8 or something like that, probably at that time, so he has already been forced to live this life with Wilson. He spent time in the deprivation chamber and all this stuff. He's been forced to learn the Latin, and I'm sure the literary geography with the map and all this stuff. He's already starting to do these things. But then when he opens up this portal into the Willowbank Tales, because that's the book he's holding right there. It's a book that Tommy loved. And, we have that cutaway where Wilson, you see how proud Wilson is in that moment.
Right.
that Tommy is able to access this power. You couple that with now what we see him, how he interacts with infant Tommy in the OGN here, and you see that is all he ever wanted.
Right.
You see that like that moment there when he banished when he banished Polly to the Willowbank Tales, that was like to that moment probably like the pinnacle of what Wilson thought he was doing as a parent, not as the father so much of Tom Taylor, but yeah, as the creator of Tom/Tommy. Like that was the pinnacle. That was the moment of like, yes, he can do it. This is going to work, I guess. Like that was like full proof of concept. That it wasn't just that he can learn the spells and all these things. That was the end of like, he did it. He actually did the thing, intentional or not. He has the ability to do it. And you see those seeds planted here in the OGN of what Wilson's hoping to do. And it culminates there when Tommy does it essentially on accident, but just the fact that he could do it shows, to Wilson, that's all the validation he needs, right? That's all the feedback and being like, I did the right thing. I did this right. It worked. I'm the hero here.
Right. Yeah. There's no audience for Wilson that he is trying to win over or impress.
No.
He is driven by his goal.
Yeah.
Which
he cares.
He plainly either makes him a villain or a hero. Like, there's no gray area. Yeah. He's not a passive character. Mm-hmm. He's a compelling guy. And I think if there were ever, a revisit to this series, without having yet read the Apocalypse, I would think going a prequel and doing the Wilson Taylor struggle against the Cabal before the idea to do the whole Tommy Taylor thing would be a really fascinating story. Like, what else did he try before he resorted to this? Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. You only get snippets of it. That from World War I, he was basically recruited, you assume, by Rausch, right? We see him leave the World War battlefield. He meets up with Rausch, and you assume that's his origin. And then kind of the next we see him chronologically, he's working with Pullman. Him and Pullman are basically, they're the Wetworks guys. They're out there cleaning up messes. And that's from the like 19 teens to we jump to the late 30s, early 40s, right? So there's like a 30-year gap there. Yeah. What's he doing? That's the kind of the area we don't have a lot of Wilson Taylor material. So yeah, what was his indoctrination into this? Because you have to believe when he was first shown it, he was like a believer, right? Because he tapped into this without even knowing it to get him to save himself in the war. So you got to think he was like he probably started as like a big true believer, right? He was all in.
Oh, yeah.
Total buy-in. And then, how does that erode little by little to the point where when he's sent to kill, the creator of the Tinker, we find out is Miriam, when he's sent to kill her and doesn't, not just because he falls in love with her, but because he sees there may be a greater power there. How do we get to that point? I think you're right. I think that could be a cool story. That could be maybe a cool miniseries, like 6-8 issues, something like that. Just to go back into the Wilson Taylor stories, or that could be the kind of thing where it's told in a different medium. That could be a short story
that's true. Yeah.
That carry rights. I wouldn't put it past them. Or another OGN kind of thing. They could.
OGN would be the best way to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
And let me put it out
there. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we need to move on from the Wilson part of this book.
You want to get into the Tommy Taylor stuff?
Because I will say it would have been unlike the Unwritten, but I could have fully enjoyed this book without the Wilson Diaries at all.
Yes.
Like if it was just straight up the Tommy Taylor story, I know that Mike Carey is pathologically incapable of being that straightforward with the storytelling. Yeah. And I did enjoy it.
I will
5
say,
stars. I have no complaints, but I would have been fine with it.
Yeah. The last time I reread this prior to rereading it for the show, obviously I wanted to get it all in. When I last reread all of the Unwritten, which would have been a few years ago, kind of in the midst of the pandemic shutdown, when I reread it then, when I got to the OGN, I only read the Tommy Taylor parts. because at that point I'm reading for fun.
Right.
I don't need a backstory.
That and the cursive is hard to write, hard to read.
It's a lot to get through. So yeah, when I reread the series, when I get to the OGN, I do just read the Tommy Taylor stuff. I just read the story because I like that. I like his twist. I like what he's doing, because you are, especially if you, like you and I, if you are specifically very big Potter fans, you bring that knowledge in. And so when you see the slight twists and of some of these characters, they're only twists and shades of characters because we're bringing in that Potter knowledge. It's one thing to read this as its own thing, but when you read it in the view that Harry Potter is a thing that exists, I think there's something a little different that you get out of it. But yeah, I skip those Wilson Taylor parts, not because they're not important, but because if I'm going to go through and read on my own just for fun, just for leisure, they're
not important twice.
Yeah. I just want the fun story. So,
yeah, 100%. So, how would you grade, apart from, if you can parse it, apart from the unwritten lore and universe, just this Tommy Taylor and the Ship That Sank Twice? How would you rate that as like a boy wizard origin story?
No, I think it's good. I think it's great. I think it's a lot of fun. I'm with you. I would want to read the full story. I would want to read. I would want the prose book. I would want to read that. And if I did, I would think, okay, you know what? This is a good setup. This is it. This is interesting. I like where we're going. I like what they set up. I think I'd be bought in. I would.
Yeah. What I love about it, and I think this makes it perhaps a slightly better origin story than Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, is that it's kind of a fusion of those with like the Captain America origin story. He has to be around the people with power without the power for so long that when he gets it, he knows the value of it.
Sure.
And
sure.
I thought that was an incredible twist, because I expected him to just be like this prolific boy, and when I thought Talking Horn was talking to him and telling him like, sorry, you just don't have the spark, I thought that was like a Captain Marvel thing, where he was like, I don't want to see what this guy's going to do with it. I don't like his dad, maybe like kind of Snape vibes. So I'm going to suppress this thing, just make him work in the scullery. And eventually we would discover, oh no, he actually had the spark all along. It was just that he was going to be so powerful, and Talking knew it, that he was afraid of the power. It's like, no, he didn't have it.
He literally didn't have it.
Parents took it from him.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I mean, that's so good. That's I just love that twist. And it's like 2 years. Like his friends are like, that'd be like if Harry got to go be like Filch's assistant at Hogwarts, and it wasn't until year 3 that he got his power.
Yeah.
First of all, hard to read those books, in that situation.
Yeah.
And I do remember that, like at one point, like in the first book, when Harry, gets caught flying and he thinks he's going to be expelled, and he's going through all the outcomes in his head. He's like, well, maybe I could just be Hagrid's assistant. That, he got kicked out of school and they let him stay on the ground, so I could just carry buckets of stuff around for him all the time, and maybe I'll get to stay in the world. And that's Tommy. Like Tommy's like, I'm sparkless.
Yeah.
But he's still helping his friend study. He knows all the spells, so that we know, like, just by the destiny of it all, he's going to get the power eventually, and he's going to be like really well rehearsed and versed in it when he gets it.
Yeah.
And then you find out not only does he get his power, he gets a super powered, like OP version of it. Right out of the gate.
Yeah. Well, but and then he gets that. But it would be, again, to go along with that Captain America, that like first Avenger thing, which I love that comp. It'd be like little Steve gets superhero stadium, the super soldier serum. Yeah, say that 4 times fast. Goes, defeats the Red Skull, but then like is able to give part of that healing factor or give that ability to everybody. So everybody has some of it. Because that's what happens at the end here. That
right.
Tommy gets he gets like the Uber spark that helps him, but then instead of hoarding that, he basically releases that. So like the spark and magic becomes more democratic instead of like elitist, which is what the kind of the people want there, So it's like if Steve were able to give part of that serum to everybody, so everybody has the ability to heal and grow and all that stuff, and be cured of disease and all that
stuff. Which two more comps. One, it's interesting because in the books, Captain America actually goes the opposite direction. He involuntarily, people like keep getting his blood and making more super soldier serum. And only terrible things happen.
Yes,
exclusively awful things happen from this democratization of super soldier. That's
mostly,
true. There are a couple breakthrough
mostly
ones, but definitely more temptation for evil than anything. Secondly, have you read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell?
I have not. No.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
Well, you would love it. But the premise is it's a society of English magicians, and magic is real in this world, but has been turned mostly into an academic field for elitists. And Mr. Norrell is like this top scholar. And no one actually does magic. They just study it and learn about it because it's considered kind of like dirty to do practical magic, to like actually cast spells and things like that.
Okay.
And Jonathan Strange is this like kind of ne'er-do-well who's just trying to impress a girl and buys like a cheap spell off of a guy on the street and just suddenly can do all of the magic, is inventing new spells and just doing them. And it's like, it's the Society of Magic is trying, like basically the Conclave is trying to suppress him and keep him down because they're like, if you do this, a lot of people are going to start doing this. And that's not good for us because right now we hold all the magic.
Yeah.
And so it, they become partners and rivals. And it's just an incredible piece of fiction. But yeah, and then the Conclave, in addition to making me think of Jonathan Strange, Mr. Norrell, also made me think of his Dark Materials once again.
Oh, sure. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Which I think in this one, the Conclave isn't meant to be straight up evil like the Magisterium is. I think it is like, oh, they are like our government and they're supposed to be good, but they are like being a little greedy with the power.
It's a little. I think we're supposed to. It's hard to say here because, at the end of this book, the Count Ambrosio that we meet, like the vampiric, balding evil one,
right?
Like. This is his origin, so we don't know if the Count Ambrosio that's leading this conclave here, if he's the same terrible evil person. We don't know if the same aims or not. I think one can presume that after this book, maybe he becomes that. So we don't know if these people are, if this conclave of magicians here, if they're like the Death Eaters or whatnot. Because I think the comp for the Peter character is supposed to be like, well, what if Malfoy were actually wrong?
Right.
It's that. So, but we don't know if is his mother, is she just like an elitist snob who hates poor people, or are they actually evil? I don't think we quite have enough of the story enough to make that call. But it's closer, I think, right now to just being like elitist people who hate. Who want to hoard the power themselves. I think it's closer to that based on this one book than it is to them being like actually maliciously evil. I think, at least.
Right. Yeah, and I think which is surprisingly nuanced for the age that this book would be targeting, in its world.
I guess I don't know. I don't think for certain. I guess the presumption is it's on the same age track as Potter, right? That
I think the assumption is almost always that the age of the kids in the book is reflective of the audience.
So you age with, okay, that's fair.
And I love the rare instances when that's not the case, but it seems more often than not, children especially have to be able to relate to the character age-wise to engage with the book. And not to overquote him in one episode here, because I know we did Bulverism and we did a Narnia reference earlier, but C.S. Lewis once said of children's literature, he said, any book written for children that is not entertaining to adults should not be given to children. And which is funny because that's how I feel about Narnia.
I was going to say, like 30 minutes ago, you said you couldn't finish Narnia because
it felt too juvenile. And I've got a daughter now, so maybe when she's old enough, I'll read them to her, and maybe watching her experience them will make me, fill me with childlike wonder. Mm-hmm. I think I might just be too big of a snob for Narnia, but anyway, I think that's something that like Wilson Taylor knows. Like, if you don't want this to be like, oh, that's a thing I read as a kid, like Goosebumps, that I wouldn't revisit now. Whereas things you read as a kid that are like more in the, fantasy and have become modern classics, you can revisit as an adult and enjoy them the same amount, if not more. There are certainly things. Had I read Philosopher's Stone when I was 11, which I don't think it existed yet. Maybe it did. I don't know. It was close for me. But I didn't pick it up until much later.
Yeah, I mean, it was published in the U.S. 98. So,
which means I would have been like 12. Yeah. So I would have been right at the age. But there are things that I would have read Harry thinking and would have been like, yeah, sure. Whereas you go back and read them as an adult and you're kind of amused by the thinking of a 12-year-old boy. Like when he asks Dumbledore what he sees in the mirror of Erised, he's thinking about Dumbledore's answer of socks all the way back to his, and only as he's laying in bed, it's like, maybe he wasn't being serious.
Yeah.
It's like, maybe that was a really personal question to ask. It's like, yeah, you dummy.
Yeah, you think?
But as a 12-year-old, you'd be tracking with that. I'm like, yeah, that's a weird answer. So anyway, I think Tommy is just really great in that way. And I would love for Mike Carey to revisit these and write these as actual books, because I think, one, that's a genre that's just never finished. I think it needs to be reborn for each generation. And I would love it if kids were reading the Tommy Taylor novels and parents were reading the Unwritten. And
that'd be fun. Yeah.
Your whole family was in on some aspect of this world. It'd be, and if he didn't want it to interfere with the M.R. Carey fiction, he could publish under Wilson Taylor as a pseudonym.
That would be good. That'd be good.
I'm like, I know that I can only have you, $20 per book to give you, but it's yours if you want it, Mike Carey.
I would be in this. I would love to read. 13, 14 books is a lot, but if there were at least one full length by Wilson Taylor byline Tommy Taylor book, I would love that. I think that'd be a lot of fun. And
the thing is, if it was this story, I don't know how this doesn't blow up, and then he's compelled to write more. Like, I just don't understand a world. Where this doesn't take off.
No, I can't understand it because presented in this way, as a story within a story, you have there's a shield there of being, oh, you're just doing Harry Potter. If you were to release this solo without the context, even with some context, like on the cover or whatnot, or in the inside book flap or something, I think people are going to read it and be like, I don't get it. It's just Harry Potter. What is this? And so
that's true.
But by doing it in the story within a story, you have the cover of, we're acknowledging this other thing, but we're doing this for another reason. So I as much as I would love that, I can understand why at this point, if you put it out there, it would just be like, well, you're just doing Harry Potter. Why are we even reading this? So,
yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to recap story beats other than to say, like the main twist for me was that he actually was sparkless for most of the story.
Yeah.
The way he was orphaned, kind of getting that touch with his parents, and then what he does with the power once he has it, like the great democratization of magic.
Yeah.
To me, as someone who has read, Percy Jackson and all that stuff, this was definitely different enough that I wouldn't be like, oh, it's just Harry Potter knockoff. But people who are inclined to say that are going to say that about anything.
That's true. Yeah. Well,
So
but again,
they say that about the orphan Annie now. Like, what? Oh yeah, she lost her parents. Were they ripping off Harry Potter?
Well, I don't think that's unfair here, though, because again,
he
the
is ripping it off, right?
Yeah, he is telling you, they have told you this is what we're doing with the story. So again, I don't think that's unfair, even though there are obviously there are major, when you read the story, there are major characterization differences, story differences, all that stuff. But the intent is there. You can see that. I don't think that's an unfair criticism. And I don't think if you went to Carrie and Gross and said, this is what you did, they wouldn't be able to deny it. They wouldn't be like, oh no, that's just coincidence. You're reading too much into it. They'd have to be like, no, that's what we were trying to do. And they explained to you, they explained through Wilson why it was intentional, even though Wilson doesn't say I'm ripping off Harry Potter. The line you said earlier, the idea about
invade and renovate.
Yeah, using it and get it so pervasive that it outstrips its predecessors. That ethos is what they're trying to portray here. So yeah, there's no way they would deny it. So those people are wrong. The people that are wrong are the ones who are dismissive of it on that basis alone without having actually read it and consumed it. That's where the issue is. That's where the gatekeeping comes in that we talked about. So I don't think there's any problem pointing out what something is an influence of, what something draws inspiration from, or even if something blatantly rips it off, something else off. I don't think that's reason enough to dismiss a piece of creative work just out of hand. I think you got to take it for what it actually is and what it's doing. You have to engage with it and see if it's any good. And then if it sucks, if it's good, that's fine. But if it's good, you acknowledge and recognize that its predecessors, that it built off of or riffed off of or outright stole from, whatever. But it can still be good and acknowledge those things. Because if it sucks, it sucks. If it's bad, then who cares? So
yeah, I mean, I hear you saying is that you and I should write fan fiction in the unwritten world. And
no.
And there's no way he could have a problem with it because it would go against the premise.
No. What I'm saying is that I support anybody and everybody who wants to write fan fiction about anything. I'm just never going to read it. I'm just never going to read it. But
that's true.
But
I've never read.
I support you going out. You wanna write and draw your fan fiction, whatever it is. You go do that. That's great. Engage the story all you want. I'm never going to read it. That's what I say. I support you, even if I'm not out there like really actually supporting it. I support the effort.
I was going to say I've never read fan fiction, but I was like, actually, I think like the Han Solo trilogy that I read when I was in elementary school would technically count as fan fiction.
I got like 30 pages.
Trilogy.
I got like 30 pages deep into Twilight. So by that account, yes, I've read fan fiction. So
all right.
Sorry. Yeah.
It wasn't terrible.
I don't mean to degrade Twilight. If you love it, you love it. It's good for you.
Yeah, I would not presume to take it away from anyone.
No.
If I can't be bothered to read it. So anyway,
yes.
Did you have any other notes on this? I know you'd written down a couple quotes.
No, that was the big quote I had. The one you had from Wilson is the one I had, because I think you're right. That is his mission statement, and by extension, what Carrie and Gross's mission statement for the whole series is. Summed up in one line. No, I don't have other notes. Other notes are just were really some of the things we talked about how fun we found the Tommy Taylor stuff. And again, it's hard to read that stuff without the lens of Harry Potter, because. But
the great thing is you don't have to pretend that it's not a knockoff.
It's separate. Yeah, that's true. That is true.
It when it openly acknowledges it, you can say like, oh yeah, they're in on it.
Yeah,
and they want us to understand.
And I think that's the key. Yeah, they want you to read it and be like, oh, that's this. Not just that character is supposed to be this character. It's not about making those analogs. It's, oh, this thing here is supposed to mean this thing here. This is the mirror of that. They're trying to do all those things. And yeah, it is intentional. They want you to have that. And I almost think they expect you to have that. Is that too much to say? Is that too much to presume?
No, at this point,
Okay.
They've pounded it into your head.
Yeah.
It's
they expect you to have the Harry Potter knowledge, and they expect you to bring that with you when you pick up and read this book. I think that's fair.
Yeah, and that this is his invasion and redecoration of the Harry Potter story.
Yeah.
And to me, he's got a different message, and he's pulling elements. I think if we had the privilege to speak with Mike Carey, I would ask him, like, did you mean for it to be kind of the weakling Captain America, tagging along for the ride? And I think I would be surprised if that was intentional. I think it's just, I doubt he would say, oh yeah, I was ripping off Captain America there. I think it was just like, no, that's just, and Captain America, like, what was that ripping off? There was an endless chain.
He spent plenty of time writing at Marvel, mostly in the X Office, but I mean, it's not a character he's unfamiliar with. I think maybe as we wrap up here, I think my last question would be this. Let's say you are 11, 12, 13 years old in 1998, when Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Sorcerer's Stone in America, comes out. And that book is out, and let's say it came out first or whatnot, but they're on the shelf at the same time. Next to it, you see Tommy Taylor and the Ship That Sank Twice by Wilson Taylor. You got both of these books up there, and maybe you ask the bookseller, and the person there was like, yeah, well, listen, they're very similar types of stories. They're very similar types of on a boy wizard orphan stories, and which is why probably they're on an end cap at a bookstore at the same time. If you had read both of these as a kid, and there's only one book out at the time, there's only one book out for each one of them. Do you think you would have been drawn to one or the other? Trying to forget how Harry Potter ended up, just off of one book, And if you were of the age where you would have been, really wrapped in them at the time they were coming out, which one would you think you would have leaned to if you were given both of them?
Okay. So it's hard for me to say because I read a different genre when I was a kid. Yeah. But based on what I know about how I turned out, I think I would have a slight preference for the story of Tommy Taylor, because it's someone who just, who kind of went through a little bit of a hero's journey just to be able to get the material to do the rest of the hero's journey. But I think I would have enjoyed the urban fantasy of, like, Harry Potter exists in our world. Like, they go to London and they do things, and I don't have to learn a new map and all that other stuff, which is always the fantasy thing that kind of wears me down.
The idea
and I think Tommy Taylor is definitely in its own world.
Yes. I think it's meant to be the idea that,
but I don't think that bothered me as a kid.
Okay.
I think it's just as an adult, when I started reading like really heavy fantasy or really hard sci-fi, and it was just like 30 pages of expositing like the geography and the terrain and like the natural resources and how that's tied. And it's like, oh my gosh, please tell me a story. So anyway, so what do you think?
Only thing I can have to think about is as when I first read Harry Potter, I read them all after the first 4 books were out, and I read them all in a week because I was kind of mostly bedridden because I had some dental surgery done. So the first couple of days I read them, I was coming off of Novocaine, and like my mouth was all like half numb and all that. I wasn't going anywhere for about a week. And as much as I enjoyed the first 2 books, I wasn't really bought in for Potter until the 3rd book, until Azkaban. That's because the first book is good. The second book is
Redux.
Is the exact same story beats, everything about it. And I was like, okay, this is very much a children's book. The 3rd book is where the universe opens up and you're like, oh wait, this is much bigger. So as much as I liked the first book and it got me to keep reading, I wasn't hooked until book 3. I may have been more hooked on the story, similar to you, given what's given in the Tommy Taylor book. I think that was probably would have been a little more compelling to me. Now, again, I read these books, at as an adult. I was in my 20s. So I wasn't reading anything at like 11, 12, 13 outside of like G.I. Joe comic books. So like I wasn't reading much at all.
Yeah.
I wasn't reading much at all as a kid. But so I that's very difficult for me to jump in on in terms of what my mindset would be, because I don't even know what it would have been then. But even in the mindset of when I was first reading Harry Potter, which I would have been 20 years old, 20, 21, something like that when I read them. I think I would have jived more with the story in Tommy Taylor. Because it took me a few books longer to get into Harry Potter than when I kind of saw what was happening and what the world was. Now who knows, maybe because we don't have any more Tommy Taylor books, we don't know how that world expands and how it grows beyond that. But even just in this first book, we get a lot more about, because we see who his parents are and their role in the world, and we get all those things that we don't really get until book 3. You know, for if you think about it, for Harry and his backstory and the things he does and doesn't know about his family and where he comes from. You know, we don't get those hints until later. A lot of that's thrown into this first book. I'm going to guess because it's the only book that they have written for Tommy Taylor. You know, they don't, whatever synopses or log lines they have for the other books, plot wise, they probably only have this first one. So they shoved in all the points they have. But I think I'd go with Tommy Taylor just off of one book. I think that's where I would have been with. So,
yeah. I think this gives you a lot more to look forward to. Yeah. You know, the end of Harry Potter one is like, you'll be back at school next year.
Yes.
It's like, okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess if you really love boarding school adventures, you know, you have to assume another plot will present itself.
Yeah.
Whereas it's like, oh my gosh, what is Tommy going to do now that he knows magic?
Yeah. There's more of a cliffhanger there. Yeah. What's
enrollment going to be like at Talkinghorn School now that he's released it into the air?
That is true. I guess because the way, and you know, when Harry Potter was first sold to me, it was episodic. It was, he's school 7 years, so it's 7 books, 1 book a year, and you read the first one, you're like, okay, these are just chapters in his life. Book 1 happens. Oh, book 2, same thing. And then book 3 happens. You're like, oh, wait, no, things are going to carry over. There's actually an overarching story here. It's not just show up to school, crazy things happen, go home for the summer, you know?
Right.
Like, you know, and Tommy in this first book, there's so much stuff happens. It's not built around the construct of the school. Again, Harry, you know, Potter leaves that construct, but early on, that is all it is, you know? Start in the summer, something happens on the way to school, things happen at various holidays around school, something happens at the end of school, and then he goes home. It's very, very restrictive in that way. Tommy's story is much more open, much more possibility. And you get to the end and you're like, oh wait, the world is actually different now. The world that Tommy inhabits is different going into the next story. So what is happening there? There's much more intrigue there, I think.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. So anyway, it sounds like you also loved Ship That Sank Twice, like 5 out of 5 for you.
Definitely. Yeah. It's such a fun read.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we're ready to go to Apocalypse. It'll be,
I think so.
We got another overstuffed episode that you've just finished listening to, and it'll be interesting to see if we've said all that we have to say about it by the end of Apocalypse, or if we need to come do a bonus episode of some kind. But
we'll try not to be too repetitive, but who can say? I've already forgotten what I said at the beginning of this episode. So remembering several weeks back now will be difficult. But
I think to put ourselves in your shoes, maybe we'll both have to re-listen to what we've covered, even if we listen to ourselves at like squirrel mode with a 2.0 speed on the podcast app. But anyway, thank you for listening. Please like and review us. I don't say that often because I don't, I listen to podcasts all the time. I don't like being hit up, but 5-star ratings and reviews really go a long way for helping other people discover the podcast. We're not narcissists. We don't sit around and read them. I couldn't even tell you what our star rating is on any platform.
No idea.
I think I use Pocket Casts, and that doesn't have a rating system in it.
Yeah.
So I'm not even helping our own cause. But anyway, please help us out Share it with a friend. When you see us on Twitter, like us, retweet us. Our creators that we interact with have been insanely generous with us, with likes and retweets, and David Aha talking with us, Mark Russell talking with us.
Couldn't be nicer.
Hillary Jenkins coming on the podcast after doing Grass Kings. So if there's something that you just discovered this podcast during the Unwritten, go back, check out our catalog. Paper Girls, Grass Kings, Kill or Be Killed, Underwater Welder, Flintstones, Not All Robots, The Seeds, Nightly News. There's a ton of stuff from just some of the biggest names in comics doing books you may not have stumbled across.
All different genres, all different titles. Yeah, give them a look.
Just lots of stuff out there to discover. Thank you for listening. We will see you next week for volumes 10 and 11 of the Unwritten Apocalypse. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Peace.